I'm a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Ithaca, New York. And for the past 5 years, we started and I've been running the edge of field nutrient and sediment monitoring program in the Genesee River watershed in New York. Now, this is part of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And so we're partnered up with the EPA and the NRCS and USDA in our local area. And this is a multi-state effort along all the Great Lakes states. Well, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and New York. And in each state, we're looking at the priority watersheds into each of the Great Lakes. So in New York, that has been identified as the Genesee River, which is the largest contributor of sediment and nutrients into Lake Ontario. The basin there, there's a lot of agriculture. It's mostly ag, and it's a lot of highly erodible soils left over from the last glacial max. So yeah, it's a really interesting system. There's a lot of stuff that runs off through the Genesee River, starting up in northern Pennsylvania and running down through New York out of the city of Rochester. So yeah, it's a interesting place to work. And so I'll just run you through our program here in New York and what we've done. And I have to say that all of the information is preliminary and it's not final until it's published in a SIR or a data release. So, but nothing should really change a whole ton from what I'm presenting now. So the Edge of Field program, what is it? So what we do is monitor agricultural point sources. And what we're trying to do is evaluate the efficiency of different agricultural best management practices and their impact on the constituent loading and runoff at these point sources. And then what we do is run a before after control impact analysis. And so how do we do this? And what's the point of it? So what we want to do is assess changes in runoff from these point sources due to the best management practices, and then model that basin-wide to determine the effects of wide-scale BMP implementation using SWOT modeling and a couple other analyses scripts. Like I said, it's done in the 5 Great Lakes states. There's been multiple publications from some of the states that are further along in the study than we are here. There's a nice story map that's been published and you can access it on the web. So how do we accomplish this? We do establish baseline constituent runoff. And so we do multiple years. In New York, we started the program in 2015. The baseline ran until 2018, 2019 at the 2 different field sites where we then implemented the BMP, and then we evaluate the changes in the runoff due to that BMP for the next few years. One field site is slated to end in 2021, the other in 2022, using our before-after control impact analyses, which is a BACI. If you're a statistician, I'm not. That's some other colleagues that are running that. So as you can see in this map, the Genesee River watershed has been chosen as the priority watershed in New York. We're investigating a smaller tributary to there, Keshequa Creek. It's about 70 square miles of drainage. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it is this drainage basin on the left of the highlighted area. And what we have are two different field locations that have different characteristics to them. So our Merrimack Farm site, which is in the upper right, it is a more high sloped part on the field on the valley walls, and it's a paired surface station. That site had a grass waterway installed last summer. Our next our other sites are in the valley floor, and that is a paired surface and tile station. And that started in 2016 and goes to 2022. And that had a winter cover crop installed in the fall of 2018 that is planted each year. And so this map is showing the color scheme of it is the percent slope, with the darker green being low slope, and moving up into the yellow and red, that's the higher slope. So the valley walls and tributary walls, those sorts of areas. So a lot of it is farmed, and it's like at least 50% farming in that basin. So there's a lot of ag runoff that occurs in this basin. And so what we're trying to do is monitor these couple different sites, and then those will be modeled into a basin-wide implementation on here. So to explain a little bit more on our Merrimack farms, so the before-after control impact analysis is we look at two different farm fields. So we have a test basin and a control basin, and we're fortunate in that just our delineations on our basins, the two sites are within walking distance to each other. So they are in the same farm field, they get all of the same farm activity on them, they have the same crops, they get the same precipitation, same snowfall, rain patterns, same weather on them. And also they're about the same size. This site is both about 6-acre fields. And I think we're fortunate that we have smaller fields than out in the Midwest, who some of their fields run up to 100 acres or so, which just has a whole slew of issues on the large scale with it, but they get a lot more runoff than we do. So this site, the Merrimack Farms, it's on the higher sloped valley walls. It's paired surface monitoring. Theoretically, there was tiles in these at some point in the past, but those are broken. So, and they're not working right now. The farmer would like to install them, but he has to wait until our project is finished. This is a strip crop of alfalfa, soy, and corn. So yeah, we also have a rain gauge here, and this site got a grassed waterway to use as the best management practice that we're implementing and monitoring here. And you can see in this picture, that is during the late fall. Actually, if you were able to zoom in, you'd see us. We're doing some soil sampling work up there with some coworkers or colleagues from the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. And on the left here, this grassy, weedy strip is a dry grassed waterway that finally got established during a dry season. So it was nice when it was established. And moving to our next sites, this is what we call the Alfred Farms. This is on the valley floor. It's zero slope overall. This was established in 2016. Again, this paired control and test site is right next to each other. They're about the same size. This site is only corn. It has both surface monitoring and tile monitoring here. And we also have a meteorological station with a bunch of different soil probes here. And the BMP that we're measuring here is a winter cover crop that's established on one of the fields. So again, this site gets all the same farm data or farm activity, same weather patterns and everything. So that's one of the benefits of our fields, is that our sites are literally right next to each other. And if you couldn't tell from the map before, these sites are about 4 miles apart from each other. So they get generally the same overall weather patterns here. There's no ridges or anything in the way. So that's also nice. When it rains at one spot, it's usually raining at the other. And so how do we accomplish this really is we install our monitoring sites at a pinch point in the runoff from the farm fields. And then we install berms, wing walls, and a flume to divert, hopefully, all of the water running off that little basin, the sub-basin within the farm field, through a single point, which we then monitor. And it's continuous monitoring. So ideally, we're monitoring and being able to sample every bit of flow coming off of these fields, which is really great. And one of the benefits of having a smaller farm field is that we're able to put up the berms to divert all of the water going through there. So what we have is some remote monitoring stations. They're solar powered. We have cameras that monitor field conditions. We have cameras that look down at our flumes to look at the flow actually going through, and then also cameras pointed at our staff plates so we can verify the amount of water going through, so we don't just have to rely on our transducer readings. We have sample lines in there that can sample as little water as 1/10 of a foot running through there, which is pretty low. And so we do all of this so we can monitor and get our samples and produce constituent loading on multiple timescales. So we can do event, we can model what the daily runoff is, seasonal, annual. We have the same setups at our paired basin, so we can do paired. We can look at a site and do temporal changes, seasonal changes, and our before after impact analyses of the best management practices. And so the pictures that we're showing is just water running off from two of our sites. So the top picture is a surface field, and that is water running off during the summer of an event. You can see that it's pretty murky. There's a lot of sediment that runs off of these fields. The bottom picture is a tile site running off of the same event. This is at a different field. And yeah, there's a lot of water that runs off of these fields. And so that being said, how are we able to directly compare events for this? So how well do these work? And what I'm showing is in this picture, it's a graph of the flow responses to precipitation at one of our paired fields. So the SW1 and SW2, which is the Merrimack fields, which are on the valley walls. This is the strip crop, row crop site. And so what we see is the flow response at the paired fields is generally similar in timing and magnitude. So on the graph, the light blue line is the cumulative precipitation over a couple day period. And the red and the green lines are the discharge hydrographs for the two sites. And so you can see that it's a fairly instantaneous response to precipitation at these sites, and that the timing and magnitude of flow at our paired field sites it's pretty similar. It's really nice. If one site was drastically different, it's a lot harder to do a impact analysis on it. But our sites are generally pretty similar. The dots that you can see is the sampling that we do over the course of these events. And so obviously when it's a larger event, we get more samples. When it's a longer event, we get more samples on it. But we collect samples over the course of the runoff event. And then what we do is we composite them. So we have one flow weighted composite sample over the event. And this is a graph showing with the actual samples that are composited over the event. So we have our discharge, and we have an R script that flow weights each bottle, and the lab then composites that into one sample and runs the sediment nutrient analyses out of these. And so doing this, we're able to do composite sampling. We can do discrete sampling over events. We can remotely control when we're sampling. We can stop sampling if there's multiple big storms in a row. We can change the sampling period over that if we're not able to get out there. Ideally, somebody would be out there, but that's not always the case. And somehow it always seems to run off on Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, New Year's, Thanksgiving, when we're furloughed. So it's really nice having this remote control over sampling. And so doing this, we're able to really cover between 70 to about 95% of flow annually with actual composite and discrete samples. So there's not much estimating of the event loading coming off of these fields. So now that we have our methods established, what are we doing with this? What is some of the actual data? So moving on to this, I'm going to show you data from our water years, 16 and 19, which is October 1st to September 30th of every year. And so water year 16 is October 1st of 2015 to September 30th of 2016, and so on and so on. And so we have all the data worked up from years 16, 17, 18, and 19, and that's what I'll be showing. So looking at our precipitation and runoff from all of our sites, each of these next couple slides are going to be set up the same way. Two graphs with our Merrimack sites here on the left, which is the slope surface. In the middle, it's the surface sites that are connected to the tile sites that are on the far right. So if you look at the 4 sites on the right, that's all in one field. The 2 sites on the left are in another field. So the top part is the percent runoff of precipitation. So every unit of precipitation falls, how much actually runs off from through each of our flumes. And so what we're seeing in the sloped surface sites that supposedly don't have any tile drainage, in those soil types, we're getting about 5 to 15% of the annual precipitation that runs off through those flumes, which means that 85 to 95% of that water is being taken up by precipitation, evaporation, transpiration, or evapotranspiration, or it percolates into the soils. However, what we're seeing at our surface sites with tile drains, that number drops to 0 to 5% max. And what runs off through those tile drains is on the order of 20 to 30% of the whole precipitation. So that raises a couple questions that I don't have the answer to, but I mean, what's happening? Is there more water being used by the crops at our sites without tile drains? Is it sinking lower? Is the tile drain that efficient at moving water out of the fields? I'm not sure. I'm sure a farmer or somebody with more experience could answer that, but so looking at our annual runoff from these sites, our surface runoff in inches of water on the bottom graph. So that is the inches of water on that field that runs off through the flume. So on our 2 left sites, the ones on the valley walls, they get about 2 to 4 inches of runoff every year. And our surface sites that are on the valley floors with the tile drains, they get less than 1 inch generally. And then our tile sites, they get 6 to 10 inches of of runoff every year. That's what they account for it. And you can see the bottom chart has two different colors on it. That is the unfrozen and frozen periods that we see. And then I have a percentage of the runoff that occurs during those periods. So it shows that the blue is the percentage of runoff that occurs during frozen periods when either it's really cold outside, we're covered in snow, et cetera, et cetera. The soil is frozen. That's how we identify a frozen period. And generally, surface runoff occurs during unfrozen periods, and we get a lot more runoff during unfrozen periods, obviously, but we can have runoff during frozen periods when we have rain on snow and the soil is still frozen. That would be called a frozen period. Or if it warms up just to 32 degrees and the sun is blazing, we have a lot of snow melt that then runs off, and that is considered a frozen period. And so what we can see is that our most of our runoff occurs during the unfrozen periods, and that at the tile drain sites, the majority of runoff goes through those tile drains. So moving on to looking at the same charts, but looking at sediment runoff from all of these same sites, we find some interesting things. And what we see is that the valley floor yields little to no surface sediment runoff and little to no tile sediment runoff. I mean, that's kind of intuition, following intuition. But what we see at our sites that are only surface drained on the valley walls, we can get up to 1,400 pounds of sediment lost per acre. And if you have a large field, to the farmer, that's a lot of soil loss from there that then they have to spend money to reestablish soil and bring in soil on their fields. And so, yeah, that's kind of surprising. What we see with the surface runoff when there's no slope is that there's very little sediment runoff per acre, and then there's almost no sediment runoff and loss from the fields from the tile drains. But when we normalize that to inches of runoff, what we see is that our sloped or our surface runoff sites, when it's normalized to pounds per acre per inch of runoff, at least in our experience, it doesn't matter what site you're at, they're generally about 200 to 300 pounds per acre per inch of runoff that we see. And that's just, it doesn't matter how much rainfall you have there. If you have rain, you're going to get similar amounts of runoff. It's just that at the tile drain sites, there's almost no surface runoff, so you're not losing nearly as much surface sediment. And then obviously, when you look at the tile drains, there's very little, on the order of like 10 to 20 pounds per acre per inch of runoff going through those tiles. And that's, I mean, due to a lot more runoff through the tiles and a lot lower sediment concentrations going through there. So looking at nutrient runoff from these, and I think this is what you guys are really interested in. Again, where the top graph is nitrogen yields by species. The bottom graph is the phosphorus yields by species. The graphs are set up the same way. And we see a couple interesting things here. In general, they're showing pretty major differences between the yields off of your sloped surface sites versus your non-sloped surface sites with a tile drain and your tile drains. And this can kind of be brought back to the amount of sediment that's running off of here. But this is also impacted by farm activity. I mean, if the farmer puts a lot of fertilizer on the fields or supplements with manure, that's really going to impact these nutrient runoffs versus if they don't at all. And unfortunately, we don't have all of that data in there, but that is part of the impact analyses that we're running. So which I'll explain some of that later. And so just looking at the nitrogen yields on our sloped surface sites, what we see is that it's a fairly good mix of dissolved and particulate nitrogen coming off of these sites, broken up with ammonium, nitrate, and organic nitrogen. And then if you could see if the scale was a little better on the surface sites in the middle there that are tile drained, but they have no slope, you see a little bit more dissolved stuff coming off, but it's still a fairly good mix. But then when we look at the tiles, it is almost all dissolved nitrogen coming out of those tiles. And you can see the pounds per acre lost from each of these species. On the left is a scale from 0 to 50 pounds per acre. And so from these tile sites, you're losing the order of 20 to 40 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So on a 6-acre farm field, that's 200 pounds or 300 pounds of nitrogen lost. And from these tile sites, it's really mostly the dissolved portion of that. So that's almost 40 pounds of nitrate being lost from that one field per year. And when you take that out basin wide, that's a lot of nitrogen lost. Looking at the bottom graph, looking at phosphorus, in general, it's mostly particulate phosphorus that we're losing, with some dissolved. And looking at the surface versus the tile drains, there is a larger portion of dissolved phosphorus coming off of the tile drains, but not nearly as significant looking at the dissolved versus particulate nitrogen species. So it's mostly particulate phosphorus. And that's, I mean, it fairly well correlates with the sediment coming off of these farm fields. And the scale of this one is 0 to 1.5 pounds per acre. So significantly lower scales, but it totally depends in what people think the major problem is. Is it phosphorus or is it nitrogen for the impact on the watersheds? I'm not here to answer that. I'm just here to give you the numbers coming off and how they're affected by best management practices. So the whole point of our project is to do the before after control impact studies. So I'm going to go over our preliminary data for that. What we see here is looking at the suspended sediment load coming off of one of our sites per event before and after the best management practice implementation. And so looking at here, it's kind of hard to see because using the pastel colors, but the light blue colors that we see are the storm events before the best management practice was installed. The light salmon colored ones are after the BMP was installed. And just, I mean, visually, you don't really see much of a difference, but when you run the statistical analysis, you can kind of see it. We just don't have enough data yet. Right now, you ideally want the same number of events before as after the BMP. So with another year or two of data added onto this, it will produce some good stats on it. So the whole point of it is to attempt to explain the variation in loading via the explanatory variables, be that the BMP or different farm activities or the climate. Ideally, a control impact study, a paired site, is you are then using a test site and a control site And so you can take out all of the variables except the BMP implementation. Now, unfortunately, one of our sites, one of our surface sites, has only had 3 runoff events total. That's one of the sites that's tile drain down at the bottom of the basin, and no slope and everything. So, but what we can do is a single basin study that's a before after impact, and that's what we're doing here. And so that's what this graph is showing. And so looking at a paired event site, so this is showing the same thing for suspended sediment. A paired basin study is definitely preferred. And so the blue filled circles are the treatment and basin, and the unfilled, the open circles are the control basin. And so this one has a lot of events, and this is much more preferred. It's just that the BMP was implemented a year later, so at least on the data that I'm showing you, we don't have much for the post treatment info on this. But I mean, that doesn't really matter. What we're trying to show you right now is what the point of what we're doing and how we're doing it. So what we do is run an analysis of variance to determine if the relationship is significant between these 2 sites. Ideal it is. At the end of the study, we run an analysis of covariance, the ANCOVA for all the statisticians out there. And so we see if the relationship is still significant after the BMP, and if it's not, or if it is, what the effect the BMP has on it. So what these analyses do is it removes the variability due to climate and farm activities. And so therefore any variability at these sites is then due to the BMP in that basin, which for us is really good, again, because our fields are right next to each other. This is much easier to study for us. And so, yeah, we're just over the halfway point for all of these sites. So a couple more years, we are going to have a lot better data. What we're running these analyses right now, though, to make sure that the data that we have been collecting in our sites are going to work for it. Because if they're not, then we want to stop or make a change to our study program that will make it work. So like I said, we have one site that doesn't run off at all. That site is going to be removed, and instead of being a paired basin, that surface site is now going to be just a before-after study for a single basin. It allows us to be adaptive in our management. So what we do is for our 9 constituents that we're monitoring, these analyses are able to find the minimum detectable change for each constituent. And so what that shows is how much of a change do we really need in these studies to show a statistical difference. I mean, you can do the eye test, and that works fairly well, but you know, we really need the stats on it to show the true differences. And so what does this mean? We need a load reduction of XX% per event to distinguish above the noise of all these events. So what this chart shows, it's our paired basin suspended sediment regression. So for suspended sediment at this site, what we need is a change of 30%. We need to reduce suspended sediment load or increase it by about 30% to really be able to show the differences above the noise, above the scatter of this. And so what the graph is showing, The blue line is the best fit line to this scatter plot of data. What we really want is that line after this study is over to drop down more to that red line. That's the desired treatment outcome, which is showing that as opposed to it being a one-to-one scale for every pound of sediment that runs off one site, there's a pound of sediment that runs off the other. We want it to be for every pound of sediment that runs off one site, we want 0.7 pounds or less to run off the other site. And that is really showing that the stats on it are good and that the BMP has a really statistical impact on the loads. And so we're actually pretty lucky for each of our constituent. Our minimal detectable change is actually pretty low. Some of the sites, I mean, they're on the order of 50 to 70%, which is pretty high. So to actually see a 70% reduction in loading, that's not necessarily feasible. But for us, our MDCs range from about 16 to 30%. And that we feel is doable. And so, I mean, it ranges for our sediment, chloride, nitrogen, and phosphorus species. And so, yeah, so we run this for each constituent, and running the ANOVA and ANCOVA on these gives us all of this data. And so ideally at the end of the study, we'll be able to compare the graph that I've showed, and hopefully it will look like the graph with the red line. So just looking at more statistics on this, this is a treatment less control chart. Ideal if you had a one-to-one relationship, all of these dots would be a 0 because they would normalize to 0 over the time period. This is looking at the beginning of the study up to just after the BMP was installed, our last water year. And so if the BMP is having a significant effect on reducing the constituent loading, the treatment minus control will become more negative over time. And you can explain some variability in this, but what we see here is our black dots are the pre-BMP, the red dots are post-BMP. I like showing this chart because we have our black line, which is what we have. The red line down there is the desired treatment outcome. That's what we want. And our 2 dots is definitely not our desired treatment outcome. I think it shows something that's really good is because right after the grass waterway was installed, before it was even planted or established, we had a couple major events. And so we had really high sediment running off of our treatment site, and not from our control site during that event. And so what we're seeing is that the treatment minus control is very, very positive. We had a lot more sediment running off of our treatment right there because the BMP wasn't actually installed. It was like somebody just dumped a bunch of sediment right there and it ran off. So ideally, after we're done with this year and the next years of data, it will move down to that desired treatment outcome. So looking at some of the results, so this is looking at our tile sites. This is for our ammonium load for a couple water years, which the BMP here, the grass waterway, or not grass water, I apologize, the winter cover crop has been installed for a couple seasons. Looking at some of the stats, this graph on the right is the same thing, treatment minus control normalized over time. The black is pre-BMP, red is post-BMP. What we see statistically is a slight reduction but it's not statistically significant yet. So the dashed line is what we see. The solid red line is what we would desire afterwards. And maybe we'll get there, but that's also the point of the study, is maybe if we don't get there, we're going to show that, at least for ammonium, what I'm showing here is that there's not a significant impact due to a winter cover crop for ammonium. That's just one example of this. I can't really say a whole ton about all of them because, as I've said before, we don't have the data. The study's not done. But looking at, for the total nitrogen load for our tile sites, we do see a larger impact over time due to the winter cover crop. Statistically, it's not that different. The graph on the left is showing the one-to-one line and log scale of the events. Ideally, that line would be dropped, and it is slightly lower, except this gets skewed by a couple events. Since there's not very many events, there's only 10 post-BMP events, so one event can really skew that one way or the other. But it passes the eye test. It shows that, you know, maybe there is a reduction in the total nitrogen load due to the winter cover crop. Ideally, it would be lower. And if we toss out, when we go through and toss out some of these events, I mean, if you look at the first post-BMP events, maybe the cover crop was planted, but it wasn't actually established, stuff like that. And so the main point is that we need more data to show this, and we're getting it. And so moving on, so some of the modeling that we can see, this is the statistics. I can't really talk a whole ton about this because I'm not a statistician, but these are the residuals that pop up from the model outputs. Over time, it's some of the residuals. And so this is from our single basin before after treatment study. And so what we really want is that, at least for these residuals, for there to be a significant difference. I don't know if you can see my mouse. It doesn't look like you can, but the upper right chart on that, we want the residuals to be significantly different. Right now, they're not showing any significant difference before after. With more data, hopefully they will. And another cool thing that we can see that we get from our model is partial dependence plots. And so these will definitely improve once we have all of the on-farm data from our farmers, which we don't, but we still ran them. And so this is our one surface field that runs off. It's the before after. And this is the plots for ammonium runoff. On the left, the 4 plots, and the suspended sediment runoff on the right from this site. And the partial dependence shows the top 4 explanatory variables ranked by the influence on constituent loading. Looking at these plots, I really like them. They're not, we're not using them for a whole ton at this point, but they can confirm or disprove your intuitive thinking on the factors that influence runoff. So I'll start with suspended sediment there on the right because it's really easy. What influences suspended sediment runoff? Well, rainfall, obviously, but it's the intensity of rainfall. It's the amount of rainfall. It's the energy, like the droplet size of that rainfall. And so as all of these things increase, you have a lot greater suspended sediment runoff off of these fields. I mean, if you just have a slight drizzle, you might get a runoff event, but it's going to be fairly clear. also, if you have winter time runoff that's snowmelt, then you don't have very impactful rainfall. It's not very intense. You don't get much suspended sediment running off of these farm fields. However, looking at ammonium, the primary explanatory variables on that are more due to fertilizer applications, days since fertilizer, days since cultivation, planting, harvesting, tillage, things like that have a much greater impact on the nutrient runoff than the rainfall intensity and whatnot. So yeah, it's just really, really interesting. And these studies will get a lot more refined as we get more data in, and we can see that possibly these explanatory variables will change after the BMP. Maybe the BMP is going to have the greatest impact out of all of these on all the constituent loads. So here's another results. This is a plot from our SW1, our high slope surface runoff single basin versus, this is precipitation versus runoff. And as you can see, it indicates a strong positive relationship from between snow and rain runoff, or snow and rain precipitation versus total runoff. However, what we can see is that that kind of falls apart during the winter season when you have snow melt on there. And what the colored dots, if you can differentiate between them, the salmon is non-frozen periods, whereas the light blue teal is during frozen periods. So this line here on the left with no precipitation, those are all due to runoff. We can have a wide range of runoff events from there. Conversely, in the summertime, when it's super hot, the crops are growing at their full water sucking potential. We can have a lot of rain, a couple inches with no runoff from these fields. And so, but in general, the more precipitation we have, the more runoff we get. So looking at some more results, this is a look again at frozen versus non-frozen runoff periods and the proportion of the constituent loading during those periods. And what we can see that there's a strong relationship indicating that there is seasonality in this constituent loading for each of these variables. So the frozen periods are less likely to have high sediment and associated loads due to the runoff mostly being snow and the soils are frozen in place. On, you can see that by on the right, we have suspended sediment. It's the second one to the right, which is the second greatest portion happening during non-frozen periods. Whereas if we look on the left, the chloride has almost 50% of it occurs during frozen periods. Now in New York, we salt our roads a lot. This site is actually, you know, half a mile away from the world, or from the US's largest salt mine. I just found that out the other day when I was looking into it. I didn't realize it was the largest salt mine in the US, but it is. So there's a lot more salt that we get running off of our fields in the wintertime. And yeah, a lot of the loading associated with particulate matter occurs during non-frozen periods. And this is interesting because the proportional load is not, during frozen, non-frozen periods, is not necessarily concurrent with the amount of runoff during frozen, non-frozen periods. So our tile sites run off all throughout the wintertime. The base flow periods in the wintertime are significantly higher, more flow than during the summertime. due to, I mean, the crops being off. There's snow continually melting in there or bound up in the top of the soil. And then it melts and then it refreezes, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's, I mean, fairly interesting. We can have a lot of runoff in the wintertime, but not a lot of loading during the wintertime. So looking at, that's kind of the end of the results from New York, what we found so far. Looking at the 5 states that we've got, this is a graph. It's kind of hard to see, but we have all of the different sites here on the left versus all of the different constituents that we're monitoring. The chart, red is bad, green is good. And so this is running the analysis for each of these constituents that I've just ran you through for each of the sites to see if there's any significant amount of change due to a BMP. Or, I mean, not even due to the BMP, just over time, before and after the BMP implementation. What we see is that, you know, for a lot of the particulate loading, it's generally fairly good. BMPs have been met with mixed success so far, but for particulates, you can see I've highlighted them, organic, suspended sediments, that stuff, total nitrogen, that's been fairly good. Phosphorus and the dissolved constituents, on the other hand, have been a mixed bag. Certain sites have been good versus not. If you look at that Ohio SW1, most of their results are showing up in the green, which is good. New York doesn't have enough data yet to really show this, but it's still being included. So, and then the white is that there's no significant change. So yeah, positive reductions in suspended sediment and nitrogen species are highlighted. However, we see, especially in Wisconsin, we're getting pretty drastic increases in phosphorus species. I mean, that's what the stats are showing us so far. Overall, for these sites, we just don't have enough data. And I'm not saying that the red is bad in particular, because what we're looking at is the efficiency of these best management practices. We want to know if it's not efficient or if it's highly efficient, or inefficient versus efficient. And so we want to do these before they are implemented basin-wide. And so if we see that a BMP is not efficient at reducing the constituent loading, you don't want to waste the time, money, and effort into implementing that across the basin. So that's essentially the end of my talk. I know that I have one more slide on some colleagues that you guys will find interesting because you're especially interested in the tile drainage. And so some colleagues in the Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana Water Science Center, her name's Tanya Williamson, is they have a SIR in review right now that they have done unmanned aerial surveys using drones across almost all the states. They haven't done it in New York yet because we've been pretty dry the past couple of years, and they need a certain minimum soil moisture level to be able to run these surveys. We haven't hit that when they've been able to come over. So we haven't done it in New York yet, but hopefully we will. And so what they do is they come out, do a couple days of work using the drones, doing visual, multispectral, and thermal imagery. Then they combine that with mapping and surveying to look and investigate if the surface drainage basins match up with the tile drainage basins. And hint, surprise, surprise, they don't always match up. And so this chart was sent from them. We have our visual imagery, which you can see some flow patterns. You can see some remnants of tile drainage on there. We have the surface flow path on DSM based off elevations on there. plot C is the multispectral images on there. Chart D is thermal, varying from warm to cool. And D is the delineated tiles that they know of on there. So when you combine all of those, since what we're doing as an edge of field program is mapping a surface runoff and the concurrent tile runoff, I mean, one would assume that the basins are the same size, that the tiles don't cross surface drainage boundaries, but what we see is that they don't necessarily. So this graph on, or this map on the right is showing that there is tiles outside of the contributing area that interact with the surface runoff. So these tiles that are outside of there interacting with the surface runoff are either, they could be adding water to it, or they could be removing water from the tile runoff. So, I mean, what they're seeing is that it makes it a lot more complicated than one would think, especially on these larger fields that have generations of tile drainage that have been broken, tilled back into the soil over time, are being added in continuously, especially if there's not great records of it. And so, yeah, what they're seeing is that the subsurface delineation is different, or can be different than the surface drainage basins. So, yeah, to wrap it up, what our takeaways are is that, I mean, just looking at our pictures on the right, this is our cover crop control and test field. So the top picture, these are from the same time. The top picture has the winter cover crop on it. Granted, this is in late May, it's not the winter time, but this is supposedly the cover crop has grown to its full potential at this point. Whereas the bottom picture is the control basin. There's no BMP on here. You can just see, I mean, visually that, yeah, that cover crop is going to use up a lot more stuff. It's going to lock in sediment in place, so it's not going to run off. So, I mean, hopefully, statistically, we can see that we have changes due to these BMPs. Maybe we do, maybe we don't, but yeah, what we see is greater slope. We have greater sediment and particulate losses. In tile drain fields, we have a greater dissolved nutrient losses, and we have lower sediment and particulate nutrient losses from those sites that are tile drained. The nitrogen speciation is different between surface and tile drainage, mostly due to particulate runoff and non-particulate runoff, but the phosphorus speciation is less different. In New York, our before-after control impact analysis suggests that we need to see changes on the order of, 18 to 35% after the BMP installation for our paired sites, and those need to be higher for our single basin before afters. We have the majority of loading occurs in non-frozen periods, even though we might not see the majority of runoff during non-frozen periods. We're not seeing our desired outcomes yet through water year 19, but that's just because we started our post-BMP phase during that time. Our partial dependence plots suggest that particulate constituents are primarily explained by rainfall and climate, while our dissolved species can be more explained by on-farm activities. And so the analysis of these explanatory variables will further when we get a lot more of that data from our cooperators. And so, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, we have more resources. There's a lot of publications out of the Wisconsin group. They started the Edge of Field monitoring program in the mid 2000s. So there's been 15 years of work on this. They've expanded it out using the GLERI funding for it. And looking into the SWAT modeling, there's been a couple publications made from the states that have finished up certain sites on their BMPs. And so that's, you can see that listed there, the citation for that. We have the project story map, which kind of runs you through what's happening with GLERI and edge of field, where it's occurring, and all of that stuff. There's, like I said in the last slide, there's the SIR that's in review for being published on the, using the unmanned aerial surveys for delineating tiles. We're working on doing data releases and doing an overarching publication comparing all of the different BMPs done at the different states, in the different soil types and the different climate zones, all of that. So there's a lot of information coming out of this that, I mean, maybe it's taking a while, but hopefully it will be very, very useful to a lot of people. So yeah, that's the end. So if you have any questions, you can ask me or email my colleagues. Matt Comiskey is kind of the project chief. He's in Wisconsin. And Becky Carvin, she's the kind of the head of running all of the analyses. And no, this is not a flooded farm field. This is Lake Ontario, which is, I mean, kind of the point of why we're doing the whole survey. So yeah, thank you. Any questions? Sorry that took a lot longer.
All right, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm going to stop recording and then I'm going to open up the floor for questions, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of them.